$18.8 trillion. That is how much debt American households are carrying right now. Not the government, not corporations. You, your neighbors, your parents, your kids. That is mortgages, car loans, student loans, and $1.28 trillion in credit card debt alone, which is the highest number ever recorded in American history, being carried at an average interest rate of 21%. And 4.8% of all of that debt is now delinquent, the worst since 2017, concentrated almost entirely among young people and lower-income families who were already drowning before this war started. That is the starting line. That is where America was standing on February 27, 2026. And then on February 28th, the bombs started falling. Since then, gas has jumped nearly $1 a gallon. Diesel spiked 80 cents in a single week, which the trucking industry calculates as $40 billion in added costs that get passed directly to every product you buy. Electricity rates were already up 46% in some states, and the LNG shock from Qatar just made it worse. Mortgage rates that had finally dipped below 6% for the first time in 3 years reversed in 48 hours, and have now climbed to 6.22 and rising. The economy lost 92,000 jobs in February. The Fed just told us they cannot cut rates and might have to raise them. Social Security is 6 years from insolvency, and the government is burning $1 billion a day on a war that 75% of the country did not vote for, did not ask for, and is now paying for through every single price increase in their daily life. But here is what no one is telling you. The gas price is just the surface. Underneath it, there are 10 economic shockwaves heading for you right now that go far deeper than what you pay at the pump. I am talking about systems breaking that most Americans do not even know exist. Costs compounding on top of costs in ways that are going to change how you eat, how you drive, how you heat your home, whether you can afford to see a doctor, and whether the retirement you were promised is even going to be there when you need it. Before we even get into the war, I need you to understand something that has been quietly destroying American household budgets for years and that almost nobody in the media talks about with the seriousness it deserves. Your electricity bill has been going up relentlessly, and most people have just been absorbing it without realizing how much it is compounding. Electricity rates in the United States increased by 5% nationwide in 2025 alone. In some states it was much worse. Pennsylvania saw a 9% increase in a single year. And when you zoom out and look at the full picture, Pennsylvanians were paying 46% more for electricity in 2025 than they were in 2018. That is not inflation. That is a structural repricing of one of the most basic necessities of modern life. And the executive director of the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project, Elizabeth Marks, said publicly that they have been seeing record numbers of utility disconnections for 3 straight years because families simply cannot keep up. Now here is what most people do not connect. Natural gas is the single largest source of electricity generation in the United States. It powers more of the grid than coal, nuclear, wind, or solar. And the price of natural gas is set on a global market that is directly affected by what is happening in the Persian Gulf right now. When the war started on February 28th, and Iran retaliated with strikes on Qatari gas infrastructure at Ras Laffan, the world's largest LNG processing facility, Qatar Energy announced a complete shutdown of gas production. Qatar supplies about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. That single facility going dark sent European LNG futures prices up 77% and Asian LNG prices up 51% within days, according to the Center for American Progress. Those are larger spikes than what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and here is the chain that nobody explains to you. When global LNG prices spike, American LNG exporters ship more gas overseas because they can sell it at a premium in Europe and Asia. That pulls supply out of the domestic market. When domestic supply tightens, the price American utilities pay for gas goes up. And when the price utilities pay goes up, guess who foots the bill? You do. It goes straight into your electric rate. This exact dynamic played out in 2022 after the Russia-Ukraine invasion. Domestic natural gas prices nearly doubled by August of that year, and average electricity prices jumped 13%. Congressman Jared Huffman of California pointed this out explicitly, saying that American families have been feeling their utility bills rising for over a year, and that a big part of the increase is because natural gas is getting more expensive thanks to LNG exports. And Chatham House, the British think tank, published an analysis this month warning that U.S. energy prices were set to rise long before the Iran war even started, because data center demand alone is projected to more than double by 2030 and quintuple by 2035, and that growth could drive up electricity prices by as much as 25% in some U.S. markets. So you were already facing a structural electricity price increase from data centers, eating the grid, from aging infrastructure, from the clean energy rollback under the current administration that has canceled wind projects and stripped tax incentives for renewables. And now on top of all of that, you have the single largest disruption to the global LNG market since the concept of liquefied natural gas existed. For the roughly 5 million American households that heat with oil, the pain is even more direct. Residential heating oil prices surged from $4.10 a gallon to $5.09 in a single week, according to EIA data. That is a 24% increase in 7 days on something you literally need to not freeze in your home. And the cruelest part of all of this is that the oil and gas companies are making record profits off of it. An energy analyst quoted by Inside Climate News described it as a gold rush for domestic producers who are positioned to exploit the chaos in global energy markets. So your bill goes up, their earnings go up, and nobody in Washington is doing a single thing to protect you from the pass-through, because the same administration that started this war has been systematically dismantling every policy tool that could have insulated American consumers from exactly this kind of energy shock. I want to talk about something that is deeply personal for a massive number of Americans, and that is the debt situation in this country. Because it was already at crisis levels before a single missile hit Iran, and what is happening right now is about to make it catastrophically worse for tens of millions of people, who are already barely hanging on. Let me give you the numbers, because they are staggering. Total household debt in the United States hit $18.8 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2025, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That is trillion with a T. Credit card debt alone hit an all-time record of $1.28 trillion, up $44 billion in a single quarter. The average American cardholder is now carrying somewhere between $6,500 and $6,800 in revolving credit card debt, according to TransUnion and Experian. And 4.8% of all outstanding household debt is now in some stage of delinquency, the highest level since 2017, with the deterioration concentrated among younger and lower-income borrowers. Bloomberg described it as an increasingly bifurcated economy, which is a polite way of saying the rich are fine and everybody else is getting crushed. And here is the detail that ties this directly into the Iran war and makes it so much worse than most people realize. The average credit card interest rate in America right now is around 20 to 22%. That is not a typo. 20 to 22% annual interest on revolving debt that more and more Americans are using, not for vacations and luxury purchases, but for groceries, utilities, gas, and medical bills. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's own research shows that the increase in credit card usage since 2022 has been driven primarily by necessity spending, not discretionary spending. People are putting food and electricity on credit cards because they do not have the cash to cover it. And now think about what the Iran war does to that equation. Gas prices have jumped 80 cents a gallon in 3 weeks. Grocery prices are about to spike from the fertilizer disruption. Electricity bills are climbing from the LNG shock we just talked about. Heating oil surged 24% in a week. And on top of all of that, the Federal Reserve just told us this Wednesday that they are holding interest rates steady and may not cut at all this year. And some analysts are now discussing the possibility of rate hikes, which means the interest rate on your credit card, your car loan, your adjustable rate mortgage, all of it stays elevated or goes higher. The cost of carrying debt in America has never been more punishing. If you are one of the millions of Americans carrying a $7,000 credit card balance at 21% interest and you are making minimum payments, it would take you over 7 years to pay it off, and you would pay roughly $3,600 in interest alone, according to WalletHub's calculations. That is more than half the original balance just in interest. And the war just guaranteed that relief is not coming anytime soon, because the Fed cannot cut rates when oil is above $100 a barrel and inflation is re-accelerating. You are locked in. The door is shut. And the people who were already stretched to the limit, the 37% of Americans who the Federal Reserve's own survey said would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense, those people are now being hit simultaneously with higher gas costs, higher food costs, higher utility costs, and no prospect of the interest rates on their existing debt coming down. The cost of housing doubled between 2018 and 2024. The cost of a new car doubled between 2011 and 2025. Meanwhile, purchasing power grew less than 12% over that same period. Howard Dvorkin, the chairman of Debt.com, put it perfectly when he said that with those economic factors stacked against them, where else are Americans going to turn except credit cards? And that is exactly what is happening. People are surviving on borrowed money at 21% interest in an economy where real wages have barely moved while everything they need to live has doubled or tripled in price, and the war just poured gasoline on that fire. The debt trap is not coming. It is already here. And for millions of Americans, the Iran war just made it inescapable. Something that I think is one of the most underappreciated facts in the American economy is that diesel fuel is the real price of everything. Not gasoline, not crude oil. Diesel. Because diesel is what powers the trucks that deliver every single product to every single store you walk into. It is what runs the freight trains, the cargo ships at port, the farming equipment that plants and harvests your food, and the generators that back up critical infrastructure when the grid gets stressed. And right now, diesel is experiencing a price shock that the trucking industry has not seen since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. In the opening days of March, diesel prices rose 80 cents per gallon in a single week, according to Heavy Duty Trucking, which is one of the main trade publications for the commercial trucking industry. The national average for diesel as of March 16th was 66 cents higher than a year ago, according to the Energy Department. And here is the number that should stop you in your tracks. The trucking industry has calculated that a $1 per gallon increase in diesel represents approximately $40 billion in additional costs across the industry. $40 billion. That is not a hypothetical number from an academic paper. That is the real-world cost that gets distributed across every single shipment, every single delivery, every single product that moves by truck in the United States. And according to the American Trucking Association, trucks move about 72.6% of all freight tonnage in this country. So when diesel goes up, the cost of moving America goes up, and that cost gets passed directly to you in the form of higher prices on literally everything. ATA President Chris Spear said at the TMC annual meeting in Nashville this month that trucking faces mounting pressure from rising fuel prices, geopolitical instability, and uncertainty around trade policy. And fuel costs account for 50 to 60% of the total operating cost of shipping goods by ship, according to Patrick Penfield, a supply chain professor at Syracuse University. He told PBS that when fuel prices start to go up, everything starts to slow down, ships slow down, trucks slow down, people are less apt to ship things via air, and it really causes a drag on the economy. A trucker named Heather Griffith told the Washington Post this week that putting 100 gallons of diesel into her Peterbilt 389 truck at a California convenience store cost her $642. That is for a single fill-up, and she has to fill up multiple times a week to keep her business running. Now multiply that across the hundreds of thousands of independent owner-operators and small trucking companies that form the backbone of American logistics, companies that typically run on margins of 3 to 7%, and you understand why the trucking industry publication warned this week that higher diesel prices will drive some trucking companies out of the market entirely. And when carriers go out of business, it does not just affect the truckers. It reduces capacity in the freight network, which means the remaining carriers can charge more, which means shipping costs go even higher, which means the prices at the store go even higher. And here is the part that most people miss entirely. Even if you do not drive a car, even if you ride a bicycle to work and have never pumped a gallon of diesel in your life, you are paying the diesel tax every single day. Because the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the packages that arrive at your door, the medicine at your pharmacy, all of it sat on a diesel-powered truck at some point. Paul Dietrich, chief investment strategist at Wedbush Securities, put it bluntly when he told NBC News that diesel is what moves the real economy. It hauls the food, the packages, the building supplies, and the inventory sitting on store shelves, and that if diesel prices remain elevated, it will be a direct hit on consumer prices. So the next time you see the price of ground beef go up $1 a pound or a box of cereal costs 50 cents more, do not blame the grocery store, blame the 80-cent diesel spike that happened in a single week, because a war 7,000 miles away shut down a waterway you have never heard of. Your grocery bill was already brutal, and the double shockwave heading for the produce aisle is something no amount of couponing can fix. Let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. When was the last time you walked out of a grocery store and felt like you got a good deal? When was the last time you looked at your receipt and thought, yeah, that seems fair for what I bought? For most Americans, that feeling disappeared a long time ago, and it is not coming back. Grocery prices in this country have already increased by roughly 25% cumulatively since 2020, according to the USDA. That means the cart of groceries that cost you $150 a week 5 years ago is now costing you close to $190 for the same exact items. And people are already cutting back. They are switching from beef to chicken, because chicken is less than half the price per pound. They are buying store brands instead of name brands. They are going to multiple stores to chase deals. They are using more credit cards to cover the gap, which we just talked about. And now this war is about to hit your grocery bill from two directions at the same time. And Time magazine described it perfectly when they said the damage at the grocery store will be felt twice. The first wave is coming fast, and it is already here. It is the diesel wave. Every single item in that store arrived on a diesel-powered truck. The lettuce, the milk, the bread, the frozen chicken, the canned goods, all of it. And as we just covered, diesel spiked 80 cents in a single week. That increased transportation cost is already being factored into the next round of wholesale pricing that grocery chains are negotiating with their suppliers right now. Deborah Weinswig, the CEO of Coresight Research, told CNN that the first consumer prices to rise will be perishables, the produce, the meat, the dairy, the fish, because those items cannot be stockpiled. They have to be moved continuously through the cold chain, which is the refrigerated supply chain that keeps your food fresh, and that cold chain runs entirely on diesel. The less shelf-stable an item is, the more vulnerable it is to transportation cost increases. So the fresh produce aisle and the meat counter are going to be the first places you see the war show up in your grocery store. But here is the second wave, and this one is worse because it is slower and deeper, and it is going to last much longer. It is the fertilizer wave. The chief economist of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization told NPR just today, March 20th, that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is directly threatening global food production because fertilizer prices are up 30% in some parts of the world, and that the result will be less food in markets and higher food prices worldwide. The American Farm Bureau Federation wrote directly to President Trump warning that the U.S. risks a shortfall in crops and that the production shock could contribute to inflationary pressures across the entire economy. Gulf states produce nearly 49% of the world's urea exports and 30% of global ammonia exports, according to the Farm Bureau's own economists. Urea prices have already risen 35% since February 28th. And this wave will not hit you at the store next week. It will hit you in 3 to 6 months after the spring planting season has been compromised, after farmers have either paid triple for their inputs or planted less acreage or switched to less fertilizer-intensive crops, and after the reduced yields work their way through processing and distribution. By late summer and into fall, the grocery bill that is already 25% higher than it was 5 years ago could jump another 10 to 15% on staples like bread, cereal, corn-based products, and anything made from grain. And the UN World Food Program has estimated that sustained disruption could push an additional 45 million people globally into acute hunger. In America, we will not face hunger on that scale, but we will face a cost of living increase on the single most essential household expense that no family can opt out of. You have to eat. There is no workaround. And the war just made eating more expensive for every person in this country. Small businesses were already being strangled, and this war is about to finish off thousands of them for good. Now, this one is personal for me because I talk to small business owners all the time, and I know how close to the edge most of them have been operating for the past few years. And what I am about to tell you is something that is going to play out in communities across this country over the next 6 to 12 months, and it is going to be devastating. The Washington Post published a piece just yesterday, March 20th, profiling small business owners who are already bracing for the next wave of cost increases from the Iran war. A wholesale trade company in Minneapolis is preparing for another round of price hikes after tariffs already rippled through their supply chain. A home health agency in Atlanta is gaming out how much gas their employees need each day because the fuel costs are eating into margins that were already paper thin. These are real businesses run by real people who are being squeezed from every single direction simultaneously, and most of them were already in trouble before this war started. Let me give you the full picture of what small businesses in America have been dealing with. Insurance costs have been climbing for years. Property taxes have been climbing. Minimum wage increases in multiple states have raised labor costs significantly. Trump's tariffs drove up the cost of imported goods and raw materials. Interest rates made borrowing more expensive than at any point in 15 years. And consumer spending, while still technically holding up in the aggregate numbers, has been propped up almost entirely by high-income households, according to the New York Fed's own research. The lower and middle-income consumers that most small businesses depend on have been pulling back. And now you layer on diesel up 80 cents in a week, gas up 80 cents at the pump, electricity bills climbing from the LNG shock, supply chain costs surging from the maritime insurance crisis we covered in the other video, and the fertilizer-driven food cost increases that are about to hit every restaurant and food service business in the country. The economics professor at Boston College, Brian Bethune, told CNN that businesses have already been absorbing most of the cost of tariffs and have very little wiggle room left to absorb higher transportation costs on top of that. He described what is coming as a persistent cost shock if these prices hold, and the trucking industry is warning that higher diesel will drive carriers out of the market, which creates an opening for fraud. Heavy-duty trucking reported this week that fraudulent motor carriers and identity takeover are extremely likely to rise as legitimate carriers go under and bad actors fill the gaps, which adds yet another layer of cost and risk to an already stressed system. For a local restaurant operating on 5 to 8% margins, a 15% increase in food costs combined with a 20% increase in utility costs combined with higher delivery fees is not something you absorb with a price increase on your menu. Because if you raise your prices too much, your customers stop coming, especially the ones who are already stretched thin from everything else we have been talking about. And you cannot cut your way to profitability either, because you are already running lean. So what happens? You close. And when small businesses close, the jobs they supported disappear. The tax revenue they generated disappears. The communities they anchored get weaker. And the big chains that can absorb the cost shock because of their scale take over more market share, which is exactly how you end up in an economy where 3 or 4 corporations control every category and the consumer has no alternatives and no leverage. That consolidation was already happening before this war. The war is just going to accelerate it dramatically. And the people who are going to feel it the most are the small business owners who bet everything they had on building something in their community, and the workers who depended on those businesses for their livelihood. That is the human cost of this conflict that will never show up in the Pentagon's budget briefing to Congress. Owning a car in America was already becoming a luxury, and this war just made the entire automotive ecosystem unaffordable from every angle simultaneously. Think about something for a second. For most of American history, owning a car was basically the definition of middle class. It was the thing that said you had made it, you were independent, you could get to work and provide for your family. And now in 2026, owning a car in this country is becoming a financial trap that is squeezing people from so many directions at once that it is genuinely becoming unsustainable for millions of households. And the Iran war just made every single one of those directions worse at the same time. Let me walk you through the full picture, because most people only think about gas prices and they miss the other 4 or 5 layers that are stacking on top of each other right now. Start with the car itself. The average new car price in America was around $50,000 going into this year. That is already insane. That is nearly double what it was in 2019 when the average was $36,000. And prices were already under upward pressure from Trump's tariffs on imported vehicles and parts. Kelley Blue Book reported this week that automakers already facing higher costs from aggressive tariffs could be forced to raise prices again if the war drags on because of rising energy and raw material costs. Patrick Anderson, the CEO of Anderson Economic Group, told industry outlets that in at least 6 past oil supply shock episodes since the 1970s, auto sales dropped by more than 10%, and 3 times they dropped by more than 40%. So if you are a dealership sitting on inventory right now, you are watching demand potentially crater while your floor plan costs stay elevated, because the Fed is not cutting rates. And if you are a buyer, you are staring down a $50,000 vehicle with auto loan rates that are the highest they have been in 15 years and a monthly payment that averages over $750, with many people locked into payments over $1,000 a month on 7-year terms. Now add gas on top of that, the national average has jumped from under $3 to nearly $3.90 in 3 weeks. In California, it is over $5.30. If you are driving a truck or an SUV, which is what most Americans drive because those are the vehicles that have been marketed and sold hardest over the past decade, you are spending $60, $70, $80 every single time you fill up. For somebody who commutes 30 miles each way to work, that is hundreds of dollars a month just in fuel. That was not in the budget 3 weeks ago. And then there is insurance, which nobody ever talks about in this context, but which has been one of the most brutal cost increases of the past few years. Auto insurance was averaging around $200 a month or more before this war even started, up from about $100 in 2019. That is already a doubling, and with rising repair costs driven by the complexity of modern vehicles, the inflated cost of replacement parts, and insurance companies passing on their own increased reinsurance costs, those premiums have been climbing relentlessly with no end in sight. The war adds another layer because if vehicle prices go up even marginally due to energy costs in the supply chain, the replacement cost that insurance is calibrated to also goes up, which means premiums go up again. And here is the part that ties it all together and makes this genuinely scary for the American household. Auto loan delinquencies were already at their highest levels in over a decade before this war started. The number of underwater trade-ins where the car is worth less than what people still owe on it hit record highs. People bought cars they could not afford during the post-pandemic frenzy, got locked into payments at inflated prices, and now those vehicles have depreciated while the loans have not. And now you are asking those same overextended borrowers to absorb a 30% increase in fuel costs, potentially higher insurance premiums, and the psychological weight of knowing that if they lose their job, which we already covered is a real risk given the labor market data, they cannot make the payment and they cannot sell the car without taking a loss. Automotive News reported that the Oakland University professor who tracks this sector said it does not take that much of a shift in demand to put automakers in a tough spot, and that the automotive industry cannot pivot as quickly as some other industries can. Stellantis in particular is exposed because they made the strategic decision to go heavy on V8 engines under the assumption that the current administration would keep gas cheap. That bet is looking very ugly right now. So whether you are buying a car, financing a car, fueling a car, insuring a car, or trying to get out from under a car you already cannot afford, the Iran war just tightened the vice on every single one of those pressure points simultaneously. And for an economy where most people need a car just to get to work, that is not just an inconvenience, it is a structural crisis. The rockets and feathers trap, why gas prices will hurt you on the way up and keep hurting you long after the war is over. Now, this is something that economists have studied for decades, but that almost no regular person has ever heard of, and it explains why the pain you are feeling right now at the gas pump is going to persist for months or potentially years, even in the best-case scenario where this war wraps up quickly. It is called the rockets and feathers phenomenon, and once you understand it, you will never look at gas prices the same way again. Here is how it works. When crude oil prices spike, the price of gasoline at your local gas station shoots up like a rocket. It happens within days, sometimes within hours. Stations reprice immediately to reflect the higher wholesale cost because they know the next delivery of fuel they receive is going to cost them more. But here is the cruel part. When crude oil prices come back down, gas prices do not drop at the same speed. They float down slowly, like a feather. Economists have documented that pump prices respond more than twice as quickly when crude prices increase as when they fall. Time magazine spelled this out this week in their analysis of the Iran war's impact on the cost of living. They specifically referenced the rockets and feathers pattern and noted that we saw this exact dynamic after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita devastated Gulf Coast refining in 2005. In both cases, gas prices spiked sharply, but took months to fully retreat even after the underlying supply disruption was resolved. And here is why this matters so much right now. Even the most optimistic scenario for this conflict, which is that fighting stops soon and the Strait of Hormuz begins to reopen, does not mean prices go back to normal quickly. Time magazine laid out the timeline explicitly. First, a backlog of oil tankers that has amassed on both ends of the strait would need to be cleared, which could take up to 2 weeks even under ideal conditions. Then, oil and gas facilities across the Gulf region that have been operating at minimum rates or have sustained actual physical damage from Iranian strikes need to be ramped back up, a process that takes weeks to months. Qatar Energy has already said its Ras Laffan facility could take up to 5 years to fully repair. The EIA, which is the Energy Information Administration under the Department of Energy, projects that even with petroleum transits resuming in April, U.S. gasoline prices will stay elevated through the rest of 2026 and throughout 2027, and they do not foresee prices falling below $3 a gallon at any point between now and the end of 2027. Let me say that again because I want you to really absorb it. The government's own energy agency is telling you that gas is not going back below $3 for at least 2 years, and that is their optimistic projection. Fortune magazine reported that administration officials have been telling the public that gas prices will return to normal in a few more weeks, but the administration's own Energy Department data directly contradicts that claim. The EIA revised its 2026 gasoline average forecast from 2.91 a gallon before the war to 3.34, a significant jump, and they noted that the normalization of refining and retail margins will occur more slowly than the drop in crude prices. And here is the part that nobody is connecting. When gas stays elevated for this long, it does not just drain your wallet at the pump, it changes consumer behavior in ways that ripple through the entire economy for years. People cut back on driving, which means they spend less at businesses they used to visit. They cancel vacations. They stop eating out. They reduce their spending on non-essentials. And when consumer spending contracts, businesses lose revenue, which leads to layoffs, which leads to even less spending. That is the demand destruction spiral, and the Fed cannot fix it because the inflation from elevated energy prices prevents them from cutting rates to stimulate the economy. The rockets and feathers trap means you get hit fast on the way up and then you bleed slowly on the way down. There is no moment of relief, there is no bounce back. There is just a long grinding period of elevated costs that erodes your standard of living week after week, month after month. And the worst part is that most people will forget why it happened. By the time gas is still at 3.20 in the fall of 2027, most Americans will have stopped connecting it to a war that started in February 2026. But now you know. The feather is going to be falling for a very long time. I want to switch gears here for a minute because everything we have talked about so far has been about dollars and cents. Gas prices, grocery bills, diesel costs, credit card debt, interest rates, and all of that is critically important. But there is a human dimension to this that I do not think enough people are talking about, and it is this. Financial stress does not just empty your wallet. It destroys your mental health. It ruins your sleep. It damages your relationships. It makes you worse at your job, and it can literally shorten your life. And right now, in March of 2026, the American population is carrying a level of financial anxiety that is at or near historic highs, and the Iran war just turned up the pressure by several notches on people who were already barely holding it together. Let me give you the data, because it is stunning. The American Psychiatric Association's Healthy Minds poll found that 59% of Americans report feeling anxious about their personal finances. That is nearly 6 out of 10 adults walking around with a baseline level of financial anxiety every single day. 53% said they feel anxious about uncertainty regarding the next year. And a Bankrate survey found that 32% of Americans anticipate their financial situation will actually get worse in 2026, while 78% predict further economic decline in the year ahead. A separate survey from AMFM Healthcare found that almost 8 in 10 Americans say their financial anxiety has grown this year. 77% say economic stress has disrupted their sleep. 67% report that financial pressure is straining their relationships with partners, family, or friends. 59% acknowledge that the stress has hurt their performance at work. And here is the number that should genuinely alarm you. 60% of Americans said they have delayed getting mental health treatment because of cost. They know they are suffering. They know they need help, and they cannot afford it. The American Psychological Association has reported that 2 out of 3 adults cite money as a significant stressor, and a 2025 Talker research survey found that 70% of Americans are wrestling with financial anxiety in a way they describe as unprecedented, with 76% feeling utterly isolated in the struggle. A Northwestern Mutual study found that 69% of Americans report that personal financial uncertainty contributes to feelings of depression. And the American Institute of Stress estimates that 83% of U.S. workers experience work-related stress, with about half saying they need help learning how to manage it. And now layer this war on top of all of that. Every single financial pressure point we have discussed in this video. The gas spike, the grocery increases, the utility bills climbing, the credit card rates locked at 21%, the diesel-driven price increases on everything, the mortgage rate reversal, the job market uncertainty, the threat to retirement savings. Every single one of those is adding weight to the shoulders of people who are already telling researchers in survey after survey that they are at their limit. The CEO of AMFM Healthcare put it bluntly when he said that behind every inflation statistic is a real person lying awake at night. When almost 8 in 10 Americans tell us their financial anxiety has grown this year, economic stress becomes a public health issue as much as a pocketbook issue. And here is what makes this a compounding crisis rather than just a bad moment. When people are financially stressed, they delay health care. They skip doctor's appointments, they do not fill prescriptions, they do not go to therapy. And the chronic stress itself is linked to increased risk of heart disease, hypertension, digestive problems, weakened immune response, and metabolic syndrome. A study published in JAMA Psychiatry found that individuals experiencing prolonged high stress were 2 times more likely to develop metabolic syndrome. So the financial stress makes you physically sicker, and the physical sickness costs money you do not have, which makes the financial stress worse, which makes your health worse. It is a death spiral that is invisible in the economic data, but devastatingly real in the lives of the people living it. And the war just accelerated it. Not because it caused financial stress, but because it intensified every source of financial stress that already existed, and slammed the door shut on the relief that people were counting on, the rate cuts, the cooling inflation, the stabilizing job market, all of it gone, replaced by uncertainty and rising costs with no end date. That is what this war is doing to the mental health of the American people. And nobody in Washington is talking about it. The war chose the worst possible moment to hit. Because the social safety net that was supposed to catch you was already shredded before the first bomb fell. Alright, this one is going to make a lot of people angry, and I think it should. Because what I am about to lay out for you is the single most damning indictment of fiscal priorities in modern American history, and it is this. The United States is spending $1 billion a day bombing Iran, while every single program that is supposed to protect the American people in a time of economic crisis is either already gutted, about to go insolvent, or being actively defunded by the same government that authorized the strikes. Let me start with the one that affects the most people, and that is Social Security. The Congressional Budget Office released its latest projections in February 2026, and the numbers are brutal. Social Security's Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, which is the main fund that pays retirement benefits to the roughly 70 million Americans who depend on it, is now projected to become insolvent in fiscal year 2032. That is 6 years from now. Not 6 decades. Not 6 generations. 6 years. And the Penn-Wharton budget model confirmed this week that the trust fund is on track to run dry by 2032. When that happens, under current law, benefits get automatically cut to match whatever is coming in from payroll taxes. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated that a typical couple age 60 today, who retires at the time of insolvency, would face an $18,400 cut to their annual benefits. And the CBO's own illustrative scenario shows benefits being cut by 7% in 2032, and then by an average of 28% per year from 2033 to 2036. 28%. For people who have paid into the system their entire working lives and are counting on that money to survive. And this insolvency date just got accelerated. It was previously projected for 2033, but the reconciliation law's effect on the taxation of benefits pushed it forward to late 2032, and the passage of the Social Security Fairness Act added another $200 billion to the shortfall over 10 years. The program's 75-year actuarial deficit is now 3.82% of taxable payroll, the largest shortfall in nearly half a century. And here is where the war makes this catastrophically worse. Every dollar the government borrows to fund Operation Epic Fury is a dollar that adds to the national debt, which just crossed $39 trillion on March 17th for the first time in history. The interest on that debt is already projected to exceed $950 billion this year. When the government has to borrow $50 to $65 billion more for a war, the interest payments grow, which means less fiscal room for everything else, which means the political will to address Social Security's insolvency gets even weaker, because there is simply less money to work with. And it is not just Social Security. When the government shutdown in late 2025 froze SNAP payments, food banks in communities across America saw the highest turnout they had ever recorded. A community organizer in one story told the American Prospect that people just want a shot at the American dream, and that by taking money that could be for jobs, training, education, healthcare, and basic needs and putting it into bombs and missiles, there is a word for it, and that word is obscene. 15 million Americans lost their healthcare coverage, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries stood on the Capitol steps and said the government cannot find a dime to help Americans see a doctor, but can find $1 billion a day to bomb Iran. Cannot find a dime to make it easier to purchase a first home. Cannot find a dime to lower grocery bills. And the numbers bear this out in devastating detail. Time magazine ran the math on what the $12 billion spent in the first 2 weeks of this war could have funded instead. That money could have provided full Pell Grants for 1.6 million college students. It could have paid the annual salaries of 166,000 teachers, equivalent to the entire teaching workforce of the state of Florida. It could have funded the entire National Park Service for more than 3 years. It could have provided housing assistance for 800,000 to 1.5 million low-income Americans for a year. Instead, it was turned into smoke and shrapnel in the skies over Tehran. And the cruelest dimension of all of this is the timing. This war hit at the exact moment when Americans were already being told by their own government's data that the systems they depend on are failing. Social Security is 6 years from insolvency. Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2036. The national debt is growing faster than at any point since World War II. The deficit is running at $2 trillion a year. And instead of using this moment to shore up the systems that 330 million Americans depend on for their retirement, their health care, their children's education, and their basic economic security, the government chose to start a war that 75% of the country did not support and funded entirely with borrowed money that future generations will be paying interest on for decades. That is not policy. That is generational theft. And every American who is watching this needs to understand that the money being spent right now on this war is money that will not be available when Social Security runs out in 2032, when your Medicare benefits face automatic cuts, when the interest on the debt consumes so much of the budget that there is nothing left for anything that actually improves your life. The safety net was already fraying. The war just cut the last threads. Okay guys, I want you to take a breath because we have covered a lot of ground in this video, and I know it has been heavy. But I saved this for last because it is the thing that ties everything together, and it is the thing that I genuinely believe every American needs to hear right now, whether they want to or not, and it is this. What we are living through right now is not a series of disconnected problems. It is not bad luck. It is not just inflation. It is not just a war. It is the convergence of every single unresolved economic crisis of the last 2 decades arriving at your doorstep at the same time, and the Iran war was the thing that knocked the door down. Think about what we have walked through together in this video. Your electricity bill was already climbing at a rate that was causing record disconnections before the war sent LNG markets into chaos. Americans were already carrying $1.28 trillion in credit card debt at 21% interest before the Fed got trapped by an oil shock that prevents them from cutting rates. Diesel spiked 80 cents in a single week, adding $40 billion in costs to the trucking industry that moves everything you buy. Your grocery bill, which had already jumped 25% since 2020, is about to get hit by a double shockwave of diesel-driven transportation costs and a fertilizer crisis that the UN World Food Program says could push 45 million additional people globally into acute hunger. Small businesses that were already operating on margins of 3 to 8% are about to be crushed by simultaneous increases in fuel, food, utilities, and supply chain costs, with no capacity to absorb any of it. Owning a car has become a financial trap from 5 directions at once, with the average payment over $750 a month, gas up nearly $1, insurance doubled since 2019, and delinquencies at decade highs. Gas prices will stay above $3 until at least 2028, according to the government's own projections, because of the rockets and feathers dynamic. Nearly 8 in 10 Americans say their financial anxiety has grown this year. 77% say it is destroying their sleep. 60% are delaying mental health treatment because they cannot afford it. Social Security is 6 years from insolvency while the government burns $1 billion a day on a war that 3 out of 4 Americans did not support. And every single one of these problems was already there before February 28th. The war did not create them. The war revealed them. It ripped away the thin veneer of stability that was allowing people to pretend that everything was manageable, and it exposed the reality that the American economic system has been running on borrowed money, borrowed time, and borrowed hope for years. Total household debt at $18.8 trillion. National debt at $39 trillion. Credit card debt at an all-time record. Housing costs doubled in 6 years. Car costs doubled in 14 years. Purchasing power up only 12%, while everything people need to live has doubled or tripled. And the safety net that was supposed to catch people when the ground gave out, Social Security, Medicare, food assistance, public investment in infrastructure and education, all of it is being hollowed out, while the defense budget balloons and the interest on the debt alone eats nearly $1 trillion a year. This is what it looks like when a country breaks its own people. Not through a single catastrophic event, but through a slow, cumulative, relentless accumulation of costs, debts, failures, and choices that prioritize everything except the financial well-being of ordinary families. And the Iran war made it all worse, all at once, in ways that will compound for years. So here is what I need you to do with this information. I am not telling you any of this to make you feel helpless. I am telling you this because the people who understand what is happening are the ones who are going to make the decisions that protect their families. Pay down high-interest debt as aggressively as you can, because relief is not coming. Build an emergency fund even if it is $20 a week, because the margin for error in this economy is 0. Do not take on new debt right now unless it is absolutely unavoidable. Pay attention to your utility rates and lock in fixed rates where you can. If your employer offers a 401k match, take it, but make sure your allocation reflects the risk environment. Stock up on shelf-stable groceries now before the fertilizer shockwave hits the store shelves in the fall. And most importantly, stay informed, because the people who are making the decisions that affect your life are counting on you not paying attention. They are counting on you seeing a 30-second clip about gas prices and moving on. They are counting on you not connecting the war to your electric bill, your credit card rate, your grocery bill, your mortgage, your job, your retirement, and your children's future. But now you have connected it, and that puts you ahead of the vast majority of people in this country. Use that advantage, be smart, be prepared, and share this video with somebody who needs to hear it, because we are all in this together, and the only way through is to face it with open eyes. That is it for this one, guys. Subscribe if you have not already, hit that notification bell, and I will see you in the next one. Stay sharp.